Yosemite National Park attracts millions each year, and most visits end without incident. But the park's cliffs, rivers, and shifting terrain leave no margin for error. Here are 6 of the most horrific ways visitors died in Yosemite, each shaped directly by their own choices. It was September 14, 2022, in Yosemite National Park. Morning haze drifted across the cliffs as loose granite dust shifted under early hikers, the angled light hiding dips and concealing deeper fractures. Chris Gutierrez, 30, had spent several days camping nearby to photograph early autumn light across the valley. He favored short, open routes and often stepped beyond central viewing areas to reach wider granite flats. Photo archives from earlier trips showed the same pattern. He consistently moved onto sloped rock for a better angle, sometimes standing near natural cracks where footing was unpredictable. That morning, the overlook stretched across a large granite slab, fractured by decades of freeze-thaw cycles. Rangers familiar with the spot said several fissures ran through the rock, narrowing at the top and widening several feet below. Dust often collected on the slanted outer sections, and when morning light hit at the right angle, the drop-offs appeared far shallower than they were. Visitors commonly drifted toward those outer lines for photographs, unaware of how quickly traction changed near the edges. Photos recovered from Chris's phone showed him moving from the central viewing platform toward a sloped section about 10 feet lower. The last images captured the fissure from above, its depth concealed by blended shadow and dust. Several hikers later recalled seeing him pause twice, shifting his stance while adjusting the frame of his shots. The fall sequence began with a single, abrupt sound. Witnesses described it as a hard scrape of grit sliding under weight. When they turned toward the noise, they saw Chris's upper body pitching forward as his right foot lost traction. One hiker reported seeing a thin plume of dust shoot outward where his heel slipped. Reconstruction later confirmed that the granite in that zone sloped at just enough angle for even a minor weight shift to trigger a slide. Chris slid several feet before reaching the edge. Witnesses near the railings said he tried to regain footing, but the dust acted almost like ball bearings under his shoes. The surface marks found later showed a brief attempt to brace with his left foot, which only accelerated the slide. His momentum carried him directly toward the fissure, a narrow opening that looked shallow from above, but dropped nearly vertically. Witnesses said he vanished into the gap almost instantly. Responders later reported that the upper interior walls had minimal contact marks, indicating a near-straight descent with almost no chance to slow himself. The fissure funneled downward into a chute that opened onto a lower granite shelf. The coroner determined that the fatal injuries matched a direct high-force impact, consistent with dropping from standing height into a confined vertical opening, an especially severe mechanism because there was no space to decelerate or shift position. Rescue teams reached the lower ledge soon after, but Chris showed no signs of life. He was transported to an accessible staging point where he was officially pronounced deceased. Weather records confirmed stable, dry conditions, leaving lighting, dust, and misjudged depth as the central factors. Investigators later found his phone on the upper slab, verifying his final position. Witness accounts varied slightly, but reconstruction based on surface patterns, slide marks, and typical visitor travel lines placed him within a few feet of the concealed drop. The case was formally ruled an accidental death. In response, park administrators added markers around angled slabs where lighting makes fissures appear shallow, and updated visitor materials to highlight how dust, shadow, and granite angles can distort depth even in familiar, open areas. It was July 3, 2021, in Yosemite National Park. Afternoon heat settled across the valley as meltwater continued feeding the river. Sunlight bounced sharply off the granite shelves lining the bank, creating glare that made the shallows look calm and inviting, even though conditions beneath the surface carried more force than visitors realized. Emily Marsh, 8, had joined her parents and older sister for a family picnic along one of the park's river bends. Relatives described her as the kind of child drawn to small patches of water wherever she went. Photos taken earlier in the day showed her splashing in the upper pools with her sandals dangling from one hand. The spot where they stopped was a familiar one for summer visitors. A collection of shallow pools formed across a broad each only a few inches deep. Behind the shelf, though, the river dropped into a channel carved by spring runoff. Park staff later explained that these transitions often looked harmless because the rock was polished smooth and thin sheets of water made the slope appear flatter than it was. As families settled around the picnic area, Emily and her sister drifted toward the water once again. Witnesses reported seeing the two children exploring the pools, stepping in and out as parents unpacked food. From a distance, the shelf looked like one continuous plane of rock, and several visitors said afterward that they didn't realize how quickly it angled toward deeper water until they approached it themselves. Emily moved between the shallows and the sloping granite repeatedly. Forensic review of shallow sand deposits near the bank showed a pattern of short, overlapping tracks, typical of children moving back and forth along the edge. At one point during her play, she stepped onto a section where meltwater spread across the rock in a thin, nearly invisible layer. Reconstruction later estimated the incline there to be subtle but steep enough to reduce traction once weight shifted forward. Witnesses described hearing a soft splash, quieter than what they expected from a fall into deeper water. When several people looked toward the sound, they saw only a brief disturbance in the foam where the shallow shelf fed into the channel. No one saw the exact moment she slipped, but physical evidence and current modeling indicated she would have been pulled into the deeper part almost immediately. The current at this bend accelerated as it funneled between submerged boulders. Responders noted that surface glare at that hour made it difficult for anyone to track movement in the water. Those along the bank looked downstream for signs of her, but saw only widening rings and drifting foam. Farther downstream, a granite outcrop formed a small eddy where the current slowed, and Emily was later found in that area. Visitors signaled for help, and responding crews accessed the bank using the nearest clearing. She was brought to a staging point for assessment. The coroner determined drowning as the cause of death. Forensic review documented minor scrapes on her limbs, consistent with brief contact against submerged rock during downstream movement. After the incident, park administrators reviewed signage along the corridor and added warnings near several access points where shallow pools masked the transition into deeper current. The case demonstrated how visually calm features can conceal hydraulic conditions that exceed what most visitors expect near the water's edge. It was August 2nd, 2019, in Yosemite National Park. Afternoon heat rose off the exposed granite as dry air drifted across the upper trails. Shade was scarce, and the sun reflected sharply from the rock, creating conditions where small miscalculations in pace or hydration carried heavier consequences than most hikers expected. Adam Hudson, 55, had come to the park for a short solo visit after years of preferring coastal hikes with milder temperatures. Friends later said he enjoyed moderate trails that allowed steady walking without technical sections. His phone data confirmed he carried a single bottle of water and intended to complete only the overlook spur before returning to the valley. The route toward the overlook climbed gradually along broad granite slabs. Reconstruction estimated that large portions of the trail received uninterrupted sun for most of the day, with surfaces often measuring significantly higher than the surrounding air. Sparse patches of manzanita and a few young pines offered minimal shade. Witnesses recalled that heat shimmer distorted the view across the slab, making the terrain appear flatter and smoother than it truly was. Adam's early progress appeared consistent with his usual hiking pace. Several hikers later reported seeing him stop briefly near viewpoints, leaning forward with his hands on his knees as he looked out toward the waterfall in the distance. Nothing about his movements suggested distress at first, though heat can accumulate gradually in exposed terrain when wind is absent. Further up the trail, the environment changed. The granite surface broadened and reflected heat upward, enclosing hikers in a warm pocket of air. Reconstruction indicated that carrying only a single bottle left him underhydrated for that section during peak temperatures. Some hikers recalled that Adam's steps looked smaller and more deliberate as he approached the long slab leading toward the overlooked turnoff. As he continued, he stepped toward a cluster of boulders just off the main path. Witnesses who passed him shortly before this point described him standing still with his hands on the rock surface, as if steadying himself. Environmental review noted that the boulders absorbed heat throughout the day, creating a localized zone of radiant warmth where resting offered little cooling benefit. Moments later, Adam collapsed beside the largest boulder. A couple approaching from below saw him fall and moved toward him, but reported difficulty finding relief from the heat due to the lack of shade and the warmth radiating from the rock. Local responders later stated that heat stroke often progresses rapidly once sweating decreases and coordination falters, especially in conditions where surface heat is significantly elevated. Other hikers attempted to assist by creating shade with clothing and checking for responsiveness. When park responders reached the trail, Adam was moved toward a more accessible area. The coroner determined that he died from heat stroke. Forensic review confirmed dehydration and signs of thermal stress consistent with prolonged exertion under high temperatures. No evidence suggested an unrelated medical event. After examining the incident, park administrators updated seasonal advisories to include clearer warnings about hydration needs on exposed trails and recommended turnaround times for afternoon hikers. The case demonstrated how familiar routes can become hazardous when environmental factors narrow the margin for safe exertion. It was October 18, 2018, in Yosemite National Park. Cool air moved across the valley meadows as autumn grasses shifted in long, pale sheets. Sunlight filtered through scattered black oaks, and mule deer grazed along the edge of the tree line, their movements calm and unhurried in the open field. Agnes Cho, 35, was spending a short personal break, photographing seasonal changes across the valley floor. She favored quieter subjects, grasses bending in wind, changes in color across open space, and her device history showed she often lingered in one area, adjusting her position repeatedly for slight shifts in light. Friends later told investigators she routinely stepped toward natural subjects rather than relying on the footpath, a habit that sometimes placed her closer to wildlife than guidelines intended. That afternoon, she walked along the meadow's edge with her camera, moving slowly as she approached a patch of taller grass. Surveillance captured her leaving the paved loop several minutes earlier, though the meadow beyond was unmonitored. Her shoe prints later showed a gradual arc toward an open vantage point, where the grass thinned enough to photograph the deer feeding near the tree line. Several visitors recalled seeing her standing at a distance, camera raised, adjusting her footing as she moved into a clearer line of sight. The deer remained aware of activity along the footpath. Witnesses described one of them repeatedly halting its grazing to lift its head, ears forward, a behavior wildlife staff later identified as an early alert response. Conditions that day narrowed the space between Agnes and the animals. The meadow dipped slightly near the grass cluster she approached, creating a shallow trough that limited the animal's retreat angle without appearing unusual from a distance. As Agnes repositioned for another shot, shoe impressions indicated she took several steps diagonally toward the grass, reducing the distance even further. The prints ended abruptly, at a point where vegetation showed a compressed, disturbed patch. Reconstruction determined she likely stepped into the deer's boundary zone, close enough for a defensive response, but not close enough to anticipate danger. The next part of the sequence relied on evidence found at the site. Disturbed grass patterns showed a sudden backward collapse. Wildlife specialists reviewed fresh tracks leading away in a widened pattern, consistent with a startled deer executing a quick forward strike before turning and retreating. Forensic examination confirmed that the pattern of blunt trauma to her chest aligned with a front leg impact delivered at close range, a known defensive mechanism in mule deer when escape paths are limited. The terrain contributed to the severity of her fall. Beneath the grass, the ground alternated between soft patches and compacted areas. Responders later noted that she landed on a firmer section of soil, which intensified the secondary impact. No defensive marks were found on her forearms, suggesting the strike occurred too quickly for her to react. When hikers later passed through the area, They saw her lying motionless several yards from the path and called for assistance. Responders reached her within minutes from the nearest access route. The coroner confirmed fatal blunt force trauma with injuries consistent with a single close-range strike followed by a backward fall. There were no signs of pursuit or further contact. Following the investigation, park administrators expanded wildlife distance markers along meadow borders and updated guidance emphasizing how quickly defensive behavior can escalate when space narrows unexpectedly. It was November 12, 2020, in Yosemite National Park. Evening light thinned across the ridge trail as cold air drifted over exposed granite. With the sun descending quickly behind the western wall, shadows stretched across the uneven terrain, softening the contrast between dips, pockets, and raised stone. Louis Liu, 16, was part of a supervised school group, completing an outdoor skills requirement. He had joined earlier outings in similar conditions, and records showed he typically walked near others at the start, but slowed as the day progressed. Staff assigned to the hike later described him as attentive but quiet, often pausing to study formations or match what he saw to the geology notes he carried. The group moved along the ridge in the late afternoon, spacing naturally as the trail narrowed. Teachers monitored from the middle and rear, while students drifted into small clusters. Witnesses remembered Louis walking slightly off the main cluster, maintaining a steady pace but pausing longer at viewpoints. The trail in this section bent around a broad granite curve where shadows deepened quickly, and several students later noted that the ground there became harder to read once the sun dropped below the ridge. As the group rounded the curve, Louis paused again near a set of low boulders. Device logs later confirmed he stopped moving for several minutes, likely comparing the layered granite to the reading materials he carried. Reconstruction showed that during this pause, the trail's appearance shifted. Dusk light flattened the terrain, and a shallow depression beside the boulders blended into the surrounding granite, making the boundary between path and slope harder to distinguish. After the pause, Louis resumed walking. Evidence from footprints indicated he stepped slightly right of the main route. The prints angled toward the depression where loose grit had collected. Investigators determined that in low light, the slope appeared gradual enough to resemble level ground. From that position, a short descent would have felt subtle at first, with no immediate visual cue indicating he had left the primary trail. The next segment of the route, reconstructed from ground patterns and scuff marks, suggested Louis continued down the shallow grade without recognizing the change. As the light faded further, visibility dropped below what staff later described as the navigation threshold, the point where depth perception weakens and shadows fill recesses in the rock. The depression fed into a low basin shielded by granite walls, an area known to collect colder night air due to limited wind movement. By the time darkness settled, Louis was no longer within visible range of the trail. The basin offered no natural orientation points and muffled sound between its stone edges. Responders later emphasized that individuals who enter these pockets at dusk often lose directional cues rapidly, especially without active light sources or group proximity. Louis was found at first light in the basin, several yards downslope from the last confirmed footprint. There were no signs of trauma, indicating a fall from height. The coroner determined that he died from exposure to cold temperatures during the night. Forensic indicators matched hypothermia progression rather than impact injury, and investigators could not establish the exact moment he stopped moving once darkness set in. Park administrators reviewed the incident and recommended earlier turnaround times for educational groups using exposed ridges during seasonal daylight changes, along with additional spotters stationed at narrow points where visibility decreases quickly after sunset. It was May 28, 2023, in Yosemite National Park. Evening wind moved unpredictably through the campground loop, carrying cooler air between the tall pines. Needles rolled across the ground in short bursts as lanterns flickered inside tents. Temperatures dropped quickly after sunset, creating pockets of chilled air around the sites where synthetic shelters rustled with each shift in wind. Jordan West, 7, and his sister Emily, 10, settled into their family's tent earlier than usual while their parents sorted cooking equipment beside the picnic table. Relatives later described both children as adventurous, but easily startled by noise, often retreating inside their tent to play with blankets and gear. Family photos from prior trips showed them arranging the interior into small blanket forts, a habit their parents viewed as typical campground behavior. A group of older boys at a neighboring site had been handling small consumer smoke effect fireworks that produced a quick burst of sparks when ignited. Several campers later recalled flashes of colored smoke drifting above the pine duff as dusk settled. The boys stayed near their fire ring at first, but the shifting wind occasionally pushed smoke and sparks sideways toward nearby tents, including the West's site, positioned just downslope. As the wind changed direction again, Jordan and Emily continued playing inside the tent. Investigators later found fragments of cardboard tubes near the tent's windward side, consistent with smoke effect fireworks that release a brief flare capable of igniting synthetic material if carried by wind. Reconstruction showed that the tent wall facing the neighboring campsite had been bowed outward by a stronger gust shortly before ignition, leaving the lower edge partially exposed. The parents heard a sharp pop from across the loop, followed by a brief streak of light near their tent. Witnesses farther away described seeing a low arc of sparks that disappeared behind the West's shelter. Within seconds, a faint glow appeared at the tent's base, then brightened rapidly. Synthetic camping fabrics often ignite immediately when exposed to sparks, melting instead of burning cleanly. Once melting begins, the material collapses inward, creating dense smoke and blocking escape routes. Jordan and Emily reacted to the noise, but the structure failed too quickly for them to navigate the collapsing material. Responders later reported interior patterns consistent with a rapid downward failure, melted panels dropping in sheets and pooling on the tent floor. The toxic smoke produced by burning coated nylon fills enclosed spaces in seconds, reducing visibility and causing disorientation. There were no signs the children moved far from their original positions. The parents attempted to reach the entrance, but the heat and sudden collapse of the tent prevented entry. Nearby campers joined the effort, using water containers and blankets to suppress flames, but the fire spread across the structure in moments. By the time responders arrived, most of the tent had already deteriorated. Jordan and Emily were brought to a staging point where resuscitation efforts were attempted. The coroner determined both deaths were caused by smoke inhalation. Forensic review supported that the ignition originated from an external spark, though the exact firework that produced it could not be confirmed due to structural loss. Because investigators could not determine who lit the device or when it was set off, no formal penalties were issued. Park administrators and county officials reviewed the incident and expanded fire safety advisories. Campground rules regarding fireworks, already restrictive, were updated with clearer signage and additional enforcement warnings. Visitor materials emphasized how quickly synthetic tents can ignite when exposed to even brief sparks carried by shifting evening wind.